Today we've got my top 10 blue cards for Pauper Cube. Now of my top 10 list, this one was by far the hardest one to make. Blue has so many powerful cards in the Pauper Cube format. There may be some rankings that you disagree with or cards that I have totally omitted. Feel free to let me know. But I think this is a decent representation of the color. Starting off with the honorable mention, I have Trinket Mage from 5th Dawn. 2 in a blue, 2/2. When Trinket Mage enters the battlefield, you may search your library for an artifact card with converted mana cost 1 or less, reveal it, put it into your hand, and shuffle your library. Now, this is personal taste, that's why it's in the honorable mention section. I don't really think it belongs on the top 10, but I love toolbox cards like this. We really don't get a lot of cards like this in Pauper Cube. The most notable other one is the Totem Guide Heartbeast, which is really good. He can search up pacifisms and armadillo cloaks and so on. Trinket Mage, it's not as good because it doesn't have as many targets, and the targets that it does have typically aren't as good. If you have a Bone Splitter in your deck, this is a second copy, and that alone is almost enough reason to run it in the cube. Not to mention that you can get card draw with Witching Well, removal with Parrot Spellbomb, Ether Spellbomb, Explosive Apparatus, and if you want to get real fancy, you can fetch up a Gingerbrute. Like I said, not necessarily the most powerful card, but I do think it's a fun little build around. A little bit of spice to your deck, you know. We can always use more spice in our life, and Trinket Mage, for me, is my spice. Fall from Favor from Commander Legends is starting our list off at number 10, mostly because I don't have a ton of experience playing with it, and I'm not really personally a big fan of the Monarch mechanic. That being said, Monarch is exceptionally powerful, at least potentially, and this is a removal spell. So it's an enchantment similar to Claustrophobia, except it costs 2 in blue. When Fall from Favor enters the battlefield, tap Enchanted Creature and you become the Monarch. Enchanted Creature doesn't untap during its controller's untap step unless that player is the Monarch. So this automatically is decent because blue doesn't have a lot of decent removal. It's gotten a little bit more in the last few sets, but this is pretty much top form blue removal. And then you want to give me the Monarch for free on top of this? Most of the Monarch creatures are not that great. There's some exceptions, but most of them, they're just kind of there to give you the Monarch. This being on a respectable blue removal is probably the best Monarch card you could be running. At number 9, I have Looter Ilkor from Time Spiral. 1 in blue, 1/1 with Shadow. Whenever Looter Ilkor deals damage to an opponent, draw a card, then discard a card. Now, any kind of card sifting and card advantage in a limited format is good. I would play Merfolk Looter in most blue decks, given the format allows for that. However, this is a Merfolk Looter that can actively attack your opponent and actively kill them if you want to suit it up with some equipment. I may be a bigger fan of looting effects than most people, but I do think Looter Ilkor is more than that. I think even beyond personal opinion, this is very good. You can play this in both control and aggro decks, but in aggressive decks, the attacking actually adds up. The inability to block can come up for more control-oriented decks, but there also may be times that you want to block a Douthie Horror or Douthie Marauder, and you'll be happy this has Shadow. More often than not, though, this is just a Merfolk Looter that actually gets to get in damage on your opponent. My number 8, Treasure Cruise from Khans of Tarkir. 7 in blue, a sorcery, delve, draw 3 cards. Now this does require some setup, of course, but Pauper Cube, we have a lot of cantrips, we have cycling effects, we have looters that we just discussed. This doesn't take a lot of setup, and even if you're spending 4 or 5 mana to draw 3 cards, that's fine. But if you draw this in the very late game, you might spend a single mana, maybe 2, and draw 3 cards. That's pretty busted in my book. This is also an easy splash for non-blue mid-range decks that need more card advantage. Maybe some decks based on Pestilence, green ramp and mid-range comes to mind. It's just a very solid card if you're not in a hurry to end the game. At number 7 here, I have Preordained from M11, single blue, sorcery, scry 2, then draw a card. Wizards has printed several versions of this card over the years. Opt, Serum Visions, Ponder, of course. Impulse back in the day. Of all of those cards, I feel Preordain is the best version. Not many cards have that raw cost to effect ratio. I would love to have this in any blue deck that is not actively trying to kill my opponent. And even there, it can set up spells matter cards like Kiln Fiend. I had a hard time deciding where to place this card exactly on the list, but we've ended up with number 6, Waterfront Bouncer from Mercadian Masks. 1 in blue, 1/1. Blue, tap, discard a card from your hand, return target creature to its owner's hand. Now on the surface level, this can buy you some tempo, outright destroy tokens, but it's a lot more than that. It invalidates pacifism effects, it resets your own comes into play effects. There's a lot of stuff you can do with Waterfront Bouncer. Waterfront Bouncer is one of those cards that can completely dictate the pace of the game and control the entire game mostly on its own. Now it can be handled pretty well with pingers like Volshock Sorcerer or Fire Slinger or any burn spell. But if you ever get to actually untap with this card, it becomes very difficult to handle, and it can run away with the game very quickly. At number 5, I have Mana War, originally from Visions. 2 in a blue, 2/2. When Mana War comes into play, return target creature to its owner's hand. I decided that I would prefer to first pick Mana War over Waterfront Bouncer because Mana War is always going to do what you need it to do. There are times that you play Waterfront Bouncer and you've just sunk 2 mana into it and it doesn't do anything else. It gets pinged, it dies to a shock, whatever. Mana War will always do something as long as it resolves. I absolutely love this card in any blue deck, whether it be tempo or hard control. I also respect Mistraven, which just adds flying for another blue mana on Mana War. But the fact that it costs 4 mana just to give it flying, Mana War gets the nod. But I can see some people enjoying Mistraven over Mana War. But for me, I prefer the cheaper effect. My number 4 spot here, Miscalculation, originally from Urza's Legacy, 1 in blue, instant, counter target spell unless its caster pays an additional 2, cycling 2. This card is never dead, and it more often than not will counter a spell. More importantly, this costs just a single blue mana, so it is very reliable in the early game. Now I've cheated a little bit with this spot. Miscalculation, Mana Leak, and Condescend in my mind are pretty much all on par with each other. My pick of those 3 would be Miscalculation, and that's why I have it here in the number 4, but in all honesty, they're mostly interchangeable. For the sake of a more interesting top 10, I've just had them all basically condensed into the number 4 slot. Counterspell. Needs no introduction, but we'll go ahead and do it anyway. Blue and blue, instant, counter target spell. Very simple, very powerful. Number 3 overall. Now you can disagree with this. I would understand it going up a few spots, maybe even down a few spots. But I do think it definitely earns a spot on the list. And depending on your environment for your Pauper Cube, it may be number 1. My Pauper Cube tends to be a bit faster than most, I believe. So in that kind of environment, the double blue casting cost can be a big problem. I would almost say that Miscalculation, Mana Leak, and Condescend are pretty much on par with Counterspell. That being said, the raw power of Counterspell in the late game, you do have to respect it. It's always going to work. The problem is it might not work on turn 2 or 3. Anyone who's been playing Magic for a while, at least back when Counterspell was in Standard, understands how powerful and format warping this card can be. I don't necessarily think that carries over to Pauper Cube as well. But if your format is slow enough for Counterspells to be very good, then Counterspell is arguably the best blue card. I mentioned earlier that I had struggled to place Waterfront Bouncer, and that's even more true for Capsize. Originally from Tempest, 1 blue, instant, buyback 3, return target permanent to its owner's hand. Like Waterfront Bouncer, this card really depends on the format. If you can reliably get to 6 mana or more and start casting Capsize, you can basically just lock your opponent out of the game. If your opponent is playing Shadow Creatures and Bone Splitters, you may just never get there. And if you have to cast this for 3 mana, it's not impressing anybody, it's just a 3 mana boomerang. On the bright side, the ability to play this as a 3-mana boomerang is good. Sometimes you just have to remove an armadillo cloak or to kill a token that will kill you. However, if you get to the position that you can comfortably cast Capsize, you're probably going to win that game. Now, it's not as powerful in that kind of position as something like Sprout Swarm because it doesn't win the game on its own. But if you have any creatures in play, if you're just a smidge ahead of your opponent, you're probably winning that game. My number 1 pick for blue, originally from Lorwyn, Muldrifter, 4 in blue, flying. When Muldrifter comes into play, draw 2 cards, evoke 2 in blue, and it's a 2/2 creature. Muldrifter interacts well with so many other themes in the cube. If you have Blink deck, you want Muldrifter. If you have reanimation spells, you want Muldrifter. If you're any sort of mid-range deck, you want Muldrifter. Hard control, Muldrifter. If you're playing green ramp, you want a splash for Muldrifter. And hopefully a treasure cruise if you can get one of those. I am never ever sad to first pick Muldrifter, and I even play it in aggressive decks. Granted, it's not at its best in that kind of environment, but it also adds a clock and draws you some cards. You can even play this on turn 3 if you need a divination. Now that's flexibility and power in the same card, and it's very splashable. I don't know if it's necessarily more powerful than Capsize or Counterspell, or even maybe Waterfront Bouncer in that regard. But it doesn't really require any setup. You just play it, you get your cards, and then you either forget about it or kill your opponent with it. This is very easily a 3-for-1 more often than not, and at its worst, it's a divination when you actually need a divination. That's my top 10 list for blue Pauper Cube cards. In a vacuum, blue has so many powerful cards that it's hard to even condense them all into a top 10 list. And even in that list, there are several cards that I'm not sure of. I do think it's a very solid top 10 list and is a great introduction to what power blue has in this format if you're not familiar with these older cards. Either way, hope you enjoyed the list, and we'll see you next time.